The hot Oklahoma sun scorched the roof of Dalton's Auto and Salvage, a rundown garage clinging to the edge of a forgotten highway where weeds split the pavement and old dreams rusted alongside abandoned pickups, and inside, 22-year-old Ellie Brooks stood hunched over the engine of a tired '67 Mustang Fastback, her hands deep in its corroded heart, sweat dripping down her neck, and grease streaking her cheek like war paint. She looked far too young to command the engine bay like that, and yet she moved with practiced grace, her fingers confident, her mind sharper than any socket wrench in the dusty shop. She was the kind of girl life had tried to break again and again, from losing her parents to addiction before she was 10, to watching her grandfather, the only family she had left, pass away 2 winters ago in the middle of a snowstorm with no money for a proper burial. Yet somehow she had remained standing, patching her life back together with duct tape, grit, and an unshakable sense of purpose born not from privilege but from necessity. She had inherited nothing but a rusted toolbox and a promise made to her granddad on his deathbed, that she'd build something out of her life, no matter how unfair it got, and she'd never let the world tell her what she couldn't be just because she was a poor girl with calloused hands and a dream carved out of steel. Fixing cars wasn't just a job to Ellie, it was a sacred calling, a connection to the man who'd raised her with greasy knuckles and stories about engines that roared like lions, a man who believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself, and now every engine she brought back to life felt like a tribute to him, a way to keep his voice in the air around her. That morning, the Mustang had arrived on a flatbed, silent and defeated, paint faded to a dull charcoal, interior stripped of its former glory, and its engine more memory than machine. It wasn't the kind of car that normally came through her shop, and when she saw the name on the work order, Jack Whitmore, she blinked twice, because that name didn't belong to any of her regulars. Jack Whitmore was a Dallas tech mogul, a man with hundreds of millions in his portfolio, who built empires from algorithms and data, and had no business sending a classic car to a no-name mechanic in a dying town, but he had, and now it was Ellie's challenge to bring it back to life. She didn't know that the Mustang had once belonged to Jack's father, a hard-working man who raised his son with calloused hands and a love for old cars before dying too young and leaving a hole Jack had tried to fill with ambition and acquisitions. The car had sat in a barn for decades, untouched, a monument to grief and guilt and silence, until one day Jack had looked at it and realized he couldn't let it rot away. It was time to face what he had buried, and someone had whispered about a girl who could make the dead roar again, a mechanic with magic in her hands, so he sent it to her, anonymously, wanting to see if the stories were true. Ellie took to the project like a soldier to a mission, pouring weeks into the restoration, working late into the night under flickering lights, digging through junkyards for the perfect parts, often skipping meals to make the budget stretch, sleeping on a cot in the garage, her only company a half-broken radio playing old country songs and the photograph of her grandfather taped to the wall above her workbench. She rebuilt the engine from the inside out, polishing every piston, rewiring every harness, even reupholstering the interior by hand because she couldn't afford to outsource it, and all the while, she spoke to the car as if it were a living thing, coaxing it back, piece by piece, whispering to it like a wounded animal she was nursing back to strength. When the Mustang finally roared to life under her touch, it wasn't just an engine turning over, it was a resurrection, a victory, and she stood back, sweat-soaked and trembling, grinning with pride as the engine settled into a low, steady growl that made the windows shake. She hadn't just restored a car, she'd breathed life into something that had been broken and forgotten, just like herself. When Jack arrived the next morning, stepping out of a sleek Escalade in designer sunglasses and a suit that looked wildly out of place against the dust and grime of her garage, Ellie braced herself for condescension, but instead, he stood frozen, staring at the Mustang with something that looked a lot like awe, his eyes glossing over with emotion as he approached it like it was a ghost returned from the grave. "You did all this?" he asked softly, and Ellie nodded, unsure whether to feel proud or defensive, but his voice wasn't skeptical, it was reverent, broken, grateful. Jack circled the car in silence, running his fingers over the hood, the steering wheel, the dashboard his father once touched, and then he turned to Ellie and asked how long she'd been fixing cars. She told him about her grandfather, about growing up under hoods instead of play structures, about learning to use a torque wrench before she could multiply. And Jack listened, really listened. His expensive facade crumbling a little more with every word, as if he hadn't expected someone so real, so grounded, to carry so much depth, so much pain, and yet so much hope. When he asked what he owed her, she simply said, "Whatever you think it's worth," and Jack felt his throat tighten, because no one had ever said that to him before, no one had ever trusted him to decide the value of something so priceless. And the humility in her words humbled him in a way no boardroom ever had. He handed her a check for $25,000, 5 times what she was expecting, and walked away with the Mustang. But Ellie's story lingered with him, haunting him in the quiet spaces of his penthouse apartment and in the sterile conference rooms where people talked money but never meaning. He kept thinking about her, about the way she spoke of legacy, about the fire in her eyes, about the way she had built something beautiful out of scrap and sorrow, and he realized that she had given him back more than a car. She had given him back a piece of his father, and maybe even a piece of himself. Weeks later, he returned, not with another restoration job, but with a proposal. He wanted to start a foundation to empower women in trades, especially young women from underserved backgrounds, and he wanted Ellie to help lead it, not just as a figurehead, but as the heart and soul of it, mentoring, speaking, teaching others how to find dignity and power in building something real with their hands. Ellie hesitated. Overwhelmed, unsure whether to trust the sudden opportunity, worried that it might be pity in disguise. But Jack looked her in the eye and said, "This isn't a gift, Ellie. This is recognition. You're the kind of person who changes lives without trying. I want to help you do that on a bigger scale." She said yes, cautiously, and together they launched Hands of Steel, Hearts of Gold, a program that offered scholarships, apprenticeships, and resources to girls who had been told they were too poor, too broken, too small to dream big. And Ellie traveled from school to school, garage to garage, telling her story, teaching girls how to strip engines and fear at the same time, reminding them that resilience was its own kind of genius. The foundation grew, and so did their bond, Ellie and Jack. Two people from opposite worlds, drawn together by a car and a shared need to heal the invisible wounds left by fathers, by silence, by all the things they thought they had lost for good. Love didn't come in a thunderclap, but in the quiet moments. Sharing coffee before dawn, late-night calls when one of them had a rough day, long drives in the Mustang down winding roads with nothing but stars above and the soft hum of the engine below, and eventually, when Jack looked at her and said, "You fixed my car, Ellie, but more than that, you fixed me," she didn't flinch, didn't deflect, she just smiled, touched his cheek, and said, "Sometimes broken things just need someone to believe they're worth fixing." And so they built a life, one not defined by wealth or fame, but by purpose, by people, by love forged in the fires of struggle and made stronger by every hand they reached out to lift. Ellie never forgot where she came from, and she kept working in her shop between foundation projects, because that's where her heart beat loudest, under the hood, where machines didn't care how rich or poor you were, only how much you believed they could run again. And Jack never tried to change her, never tried to polish her into something shinier. He simply stood beside her, proud and grateful, watching her light ignite lives across the country, knowing that he'd found something far rarer than any tech breakthrough. He'd found the kind of strength that doesn't wear labels, the kind of beauty that doesn't fade, the kind of woman who doesn't just fix engines, she transforms lives. And every time that old Mustang rumbled to life, whether parked in front of a school or rolling down a quiet highway, it carried more than just horsepower, it carried a story, a legacy, and the reminder that sometimes, the most powerful journeys begin not with a roar, but with a whisper, a wrench, and a girl who refused to quit.